two, three.
Because that
Well,
was a big.
let me give you a practical example so we can let the listeners, really understand what we're talking about.
Mhm.
I know you're in Miami, so you do know Gabrielle Union, right?
Mhm.
Right. All right. So when she was 19, she was working in a store and somebody came into the store and raped her.
Mhm.
And that has been, she's got PTSD. I read her book and she talked about the fact that, you know, she doesn't go certain places and she's scared to go certain places and she's always reliving it. And now that she's got kids and she's warning them, don't go there and whatever. So give us an example of you're raped. What happens in life? How does little T traumas feel like that rape?
Right. So when the brain records that kind of level of stress, right? It's an invasion of my privacy. It's an invasion of who I am. It is, my life was at risk in that
Mhm,
moment, right?
mhm.
So it starts recording everything. Like we think that it's just going to record what we're seeing, is what we're feeling, right? So all these things get recorded as high risk. The
Mhm.
temperature in the room, high risk,
Wow.
right? So sometimes the person can walk into a room that looks like, feels like,
Mhm.
sounds
Get you.
like, and we
The
use the
same
word
room,
triggered.
right?
It's like,
Hmm.
this feels the same, right? Because after a traumatic experience, the body is recording all that information through the brain systems, and then it's always looking for that environment.
Welcome back to the Transform Your Mind to Transform Your Life radio, podcast, and television show. I'm your host, Life Coach Myrna Young, and sitting in the guest chair today is Dr. Hector Rodriguez. Dr. Hector and I are going to be talking on the topic Rewire Your Brain After Trauma, the neuroscience of emotional healing. Welcome, Dr. Hector.
Thank you for having me.
You're very welcome. I'm going to enjoy our conversation today. All right, so let's dive in. All right, so the Transform Your Mind show is where you can transform your life. If you've ever felt stuck in patterns of stress, trauma, or emotional pain, if you ever wondered, why do I keep reacting this way? This conversation is for you. All right. So today we're diving into the science of the brain, emotional resilience, and the powerful truth that you are not broken. My guest today is Dr. Hector Rodriguez. He is a bilingual psychiatrist and brain expert who blends neuroscience with SPECT brain imaging and lifestyle psychiatry with spiritual insight. With both a medical degree and a master of divinity, he bridges science and soul to help people rewire their brains and claim clarity, connection, and purpose. So get ready to learn how to move from survival mode into a life of thriving. Love this, Dr. Hector. So as we set the table, I want to ask you, I love your message that you're not broken, that we are wired to survive. That alone feels very healing. What does that statement truly mean from a brain science perspective?
So whenever we get any stressors that occur to us in life, the brain starts learning. The brain starts paying attention, starts realizing how, the stressor is, right? Is it a really big one? Is it a middle one? Is it a little tiny one? And as it starts to learn, it starts creating the networks and connections to see how kind of controls how we react to situations. And I use the word control because the brain really controls everything about us. People think that we're, you know, It's us, right? And yes, in part, we could redirect some brain activity in different ways, but the brain's job is really to protect us. It's really to keep us safe. And as it starts learning the experiences that we have, it creates this like certain network to let us know, oh, if this happens again, do this, right? So that's what tends to happen when we experience stressors, is right? It starts learning, creates a network, and then it says, if this happens again, we're going to do all this.
Yeah, I know that. I know that the brain is it responds to keep us safe. And it responds to keep us safe, like for instance, if we are saying, okay, we want to take this risk, right? The
Hmm.
brain is going to try to, tell us that this is the safer path. But I didn't understand trauma. To me, you're right. So there's big T and little t, right? Or you call them big stressors and little stressors.
Hmm.
So maybe a little stressor is um, I would think, but doesn't really happen. A little stressor would be, being stuck on the highway for like several
Yep.
hours,
Yep.
which
Yep.
happened
Just
to
like
me
that.
recently, right? We're in Florida here, and I was driving on Alligator Alley, a couple weeks ago, and they closed the darn road. So
Uh-huh.
so I was literally stopped for several hours, and that's a big
Right.
stress. And that's a
Hmm.
that's a big stressor to me, but it's a little stressor in terms of life. But
Right.
so we have a bigger stressor if someone dies or whatever. So how does the brain get involved in these traumas? Like, I mean, you said that it wires itself with some networks to keep us safe. Give us an example of what it does so that the next time, all right, so next time I'm stuck in a traffic jam, there's really nothing I can do.
Right. So, when we talk about traumas or stressors, yeah, there's the big T traumas, which we tend to see them as like an assault, right? Things that might not happen to anyone, or if it does, it happens to, several people in a lifetime, right? The middle T traumas or the middle T stressors, right, are big life changes that we all kind of go through. And I'm talking about like marriage, having kids, right? Those are traumatic experiences or stressful experiences in a person's life, right? So we tend to live in these. This is what most people experience as major changes in their life and major stressors. And yes, then there's a little T traumas like that. The coffee spilled over on top of you while you were driving. You're like, oh my gosh, like, but the brain learns all of them the same way. And what I mean by that is the different parts of the brain that work when it comes to regulate our emotions, like the temporal lobes, right? It regulates how we're going to react to something. I call those the emotional brakes of the car, right? So we get anxious, we get stressed about something, right? We got all the information goes to the brain, and then the brain goes, no, wait a minute. I don't have to react as bad to this because I already know that this is not a big T trauma, right? It's not a big stressor, right? So it tends to gauge the sensory, right? The sensory information, all the stuff around us. So that's how it starts behaving. And the more we experience things, the more it starts learning. And then it spits out information like how much to react, how little to react. So then if it happens again, it remembers, okay, well, this happened to me last time. I already know how to solve it. I don't have
Mhm.
to react. So we don't have to turn on that temporal lobe to say, oh my gosh, freak out. No, no, wait a minute. This already happened before. I already know what this is like. Turn on the memory, turn on the functional areas of my brain to kind of get through this stressor. So that's what I mean about it starts learning. And the more stressors we deal with, and that's just part of development, right? When you're, a toddler, you have stressors. But
Mhm.
when you get older and older, you start realizing, well, those are not as bad anymore, but now I'm facing new ones. The brain is still going to react. All those sensory informations, all those different circuits, all those brain areas, they're still going to turn on, but now it has the concept of memory, right? It remembered that this is not as bad, so I don't have to react, for example. I don't have to get frustrated. Now, if people have had major life stressors, probably the stressors that you and I deal with could be actually be amplified the reaction that they have to them. So like I have a major life stressor, right? Let's say a rape, an assault, something like that, really big, right? Um, Now my little t traumas can feel the same way,
Mm,
right?
interesting.
So
Right.
it's a change. It's a drastic change and when someone experiences a stressor. Because in the normal development of life, we experience stressors throughout life and then we adjust and the brain learns and we adjust, like I talked earlier. But then if we have a big one that I didn't know how to react to it, and my life was at risk, then now the brain gets rewired in a way that is what I call trauma patterns that are only seen in people who've experienced big T traumas, right? And when I see by seen, as we talked about, you mentioned that, yeah, I work with SPECT imaging. SPECT imaging lets us see how the brain functions. So there's certain parts of the brain that light up on a SPECT scan, letting me know this person experienced emotional trauma versus an assault, which is something that they saw and that they witnessed, right?
Mm,
And again, it doesn't have to have happened to them. They could have seen it happen to another person, and it creates the same patterns
same
because
patterns.
it's a survival mechanism, right? The
Right.
brain wants to keep me safe. So if I
Right.
recorded all this information, now it's like, oh, wait a minute. Is my life at risk always?
Okay.
Because that
Well,
was a big.
let me give you a practical example so we can let the listeners, really understand what we're talking about.
Mhm,
I know you're in Miami, so you do know Gabrielle Union, right?
mhm,
Right. All right. So when she was 19, she was working in a store and somebody came into the store and raped her.
mhm,
And that has been, she's got PTSD. I read her book and she talked about the fact that, you know, she doesn't go certain places and she's scared to go certain places and she's always reliving it. And now that she's got kids and she's warning them, don't go there and whatever. So give us an example of you're raped. What happens in life? How does little t traumas feel like that rape?
right. So when the brain records that kind of level of stress, right? It's an invasion of my privacy. It's an invasion of who I am. It is, my life was at risk in that
Mm-hmm,
moment, right?
mm-hmm,
So it starts recording everything. Like we think that it's just going to record what we're seeing, is what we're feeling, right? So all these things get recorded as high risk. The
mm-hmm.
temperature in the room, high risk,
Wow.
right? So sometimes the person can walk into a room that looks like, feels like,
Mm-hmm. I
sounds
get you.
like, and we
The
use the
same
word
room,
triggered.
right?
It's like,
Mm-hmm.
this feels the same, right? Because after a traumatic experience, the body is recording all that information through the brain systems, and then it's always looking for that environment. Does that make
Mm-hmm.
sense? So then
Yeah,
that's what
yeah.
happens, right?
I
They're
get
always in
that.
hypervigilant mode.
Yeah. And that's exactly what she is actually. She's in hypervigilant mode all the time. Yes.
Mhm.
So that was a good example. So yeah, I wanted to, tie it
Yeah.
together. Right. So let's talk about some survival patterns using the same scenario,
Mhm.
right? What are some common survival patterns that people don't even realize they're stuck in? So we can use the big T, the middle T, or whatever small t you want to understand. Just
Yeah,
explain what
it's
that
the
is.
wired is all the same. That's the thing about it.
Okay. I'm
So
sorry, what was that?
no, that the wiring is all the same.
It's all the
So, for
same, right?
example,
Okay.
I experienced a fall a couple of months ago. I twisted my ankle really bad in Brickell. I was trying to get in my car, and I didn't know there was a hole right next to the wheel. It was
Mhm.
dark, and I was stepping out of the sidewalk to get in the car, and I stepped into the hole, twisted my ankle. When I walked by there, now, I'm always careful of not walking in a hole. And it might not even be the same side of the street either, because it legit happened to me 2 months ago that I was in the same area because I went to the same restaurant. And I'm
Right,
like,
right,
okay, this feels like, sounds like, it's at night, it's the same thing. Am I going to get injured? Again,
right.
was my
Mhm.
life at risk? No. I twisted my ankle. It was bad. I had to go to the hospital.
Yeah,
But
that's
I,
painful too, right?
yeah, it was horrible. So then
Yeah.
what happens now? I'm always careful
Mm.
more than usual. That before I wouldn't pay attention to that. I would just kind of walk and like whatever, right? So the same
Mhm.
thing happens with the big T traumas. The thing with the big T traumas is that your life, it was at danger, right? It was at risk,
Mhm.
right? I had a family that I'm treating. They went through a hurricane, right? It was a major life stressor. It was
Yeah,
one of the big
those
T
are.
traumas. So
Mhm.
anytime the weather just changes a little bit, they can get triggered. Is it
Yeah,
going to happen again?
yeah,
Right.
it
So,
could.
so that's that
Those
hypervigilant
hurricanes come
mode.
every year.
And exactly, especially here in Florida.
Yeah, right. Yes.
So that's what tends to happen, right? There's different circuitry that records information, right? Our prefrontal cortex, our PFC, is in charge of discarding or paying attention to certain things. So in those people, that prefrontal cortex goes down in activity, so then they have a hard time discarding information, right? Discarding, well, this is not going to happen again. I don't have to pay attention to this street, right? To this time of the day, to this restaurant that I'm not going to twist my ankle here again. But because there's poor activity, now I'm hyper focused on that, right? Too much focus. Because people think that, oh, if there's a problem in the brain, it's because there's low XYZ. No, it could also be extremely elevated. And when it comes,
Yeah.
for example, to sexual assaults,
Mhm.
um, sometimes that's why when some people experience actually hypersexuality after the assault, which you would think that the person does not want to even come near sex, which is the most people, excuse me, that experience a sexual assault. That's what ends up happening. But there is still some people that actually become hypersexual after the sexual assault. So basically, what happens is that there's a completely imbalance of
Mhm.
the system that deals with sexuality in our brain, for example.
Mhm.
So what tends to be distorted is the balance, right? Some of
Okay.
these responses and behaviors become huge, like hyper or hypo. So
Okay.
that's where
Well,
the
that's
issue happens.
that's a good one. That's a good one because I have interviewed, because it's part of my life story. I've
Mhm,
interviewed a lot of women on this show that were sexually abused as a child, and they became promiscuous. They
mhm,
became, like, yeah, and some of them has explained it so that they were trying to feel because somehow this person took away their connection ability and all
mhm,
that. But I've never tried to understand that. But we can probably use that example to talk about a survival pattern because to me, a survival pattern is where you're stuck in this pattern and it's your brain trying to make you survive. So explain that to us. What actually happens when something bad happened to her, big T, little t, small t, whatever. And all of a sudden we're stuck in this, the brain gives us this pattern that we're stuck in. So perfect example of being promiscuous. You're stuck on this pattern, but it's a survival pattern for some
mhm.
reason.
Yeah.
I mean, I've never understood it because you're right. Mine would be, don't you ever come near me.
Mhm,
I don't want men to touch me.
mhm,
My body is
mhm,
repulsed by them.
mhm, mhm.
Right.
Mhm.
Mhm.
So when it comes to trauma patterns are very unique to every individual. It's really difficult to predict what the pattern is going to be, but it definitely creates a pattern of behavior, right? Some
Mhm.
people do a lot of avoidance, which is the most common thing that's seen in people with
Mhm. Mhm.
PTSD.
Mhm.
But sometimes it's not avoidance. It becomes also hyper focus on a specific area where they might even become hyper focused on the theme of trauma, right? Or hyper focused on the theme of that thing, because there becomes a way to, yes, to try to understand the behavior, to try to understand the act, and that's another pattern of understanding how people behave. So the patterns of trauma are just very unique to every individual. And to say that this will occur to this person versus this other one, you really don't. Because that's when your animalistic instincts kick in.
Mhm.
And they are there, but the way that they manifest in each individual after a traumatic experience are very different.
Mm-hmm.
But what I try to do is like, okay, let's look at this pattern of behavior that you're stuck in, this loop. What can we do to keep you, to release you? For me, trauma victory, right? Because I don't like to use the word survival for many reasons. We're not going to get into that. But,
I hear
you
you.
know, for me to say, I'm going to be able to heal from this experience, right? Takes a lot of time, and there's different ways and different avenues depending on the pattern for each individual, right? For some people, it might be completely avoidance of sleep, for example, which is a very common one in a lot of trauma people that experience traumatic experiences because of the feeling of vulnerability, right?
Mm-hmm.
When we feel vulnerable, then we say, my guard is down. It
Right.
could, someone can do something to me again. So what do? They literally fear falling asleep. They
Wow.
don't like to fall asleep. Most people with traumatic experiences have a hard time falling asleep. But then there's people that that's the only thing that is seen as a trauma pattern. It's poor sleep. They
Mm.
don't have any other ones, right?
Wow.
Even they could have experienced the same assault, right?
Yeah.
I've had patients where it's been certain visuals, right? Certain things. I had a patient that it was the color green, and it was because he was assaulted in a room that was green, and he
Mm-hmm.
remembered that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And while the assault was occurring, he was just staring at the wall.
The
So
walls, right?
that's his fear. So he can't be around anything that is green. He can't see anything green, for example, right? So there's very specific things to every individual depending on what they fixated during the event and what their brain
Uh-huh.
recorded as that is
Right.
safe enough for me to get
Mm-hmm.
through this moment. And then, you know, and then we go into like people that had repetitive traumatic experiences.
Wow.
And then
Yeah.
sometimes what happens is they'll look for the same thing to survive that moment, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's a really good book that talks about how when an animal is trapped, for example, a bird, you trap it, the first thing it does, it freezes.
Mm-hmm.
Right? They'll hear the word, oh, it's playing dead. So it can let the person know I'm dead. Give
Right.
me. But it comes from a place of survival where if when the
Mm-hmm.
assault is happening, if I just freeze, maybe it'll stop. Like leave me alone. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Not everyone fights in an assault. Most
Mm-hmm.
people actually don't fight in an assault. And it's
Mm-hmm.
because of that. Their nervous system kind of freaks
Freeze
out
it.
in that moment, and then you
Wow.
freeze is one of the things that tends to happen. Some people do move, right, fight or run away, but not everybody. Most people just freeze because their ability to switch from one system to the next in that moment is kind of distorted.
Mm. Wow. 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 So this is a good segue to ask the question, what exactly is happening in the brain with trauma? So you just said that the brain responds differently with everybody, but it is an organ that probably has the same building blocks, right? So why does it choose to have this pathway in one person and a different pathway in a different person? So I guess you can explain that by saying what's happening in the brain. How does the brain physically change with trauma?
It changes depending on what the type of trauma that it does do. So, for
Okay.
example, if it's emotional trauma, you tend to have a lot of limbic activity. Limbic activity is the part of the brain that controls our emotions, our limbic system, but it also
Mm-hmm.
controls a lot of our circadian rhythms. So, for
Mm-hmm.
example, if there's emotional type of abuse, they tend to have a really active limbic system, a lot more than the other one. But we all know that most people who've experienced traumatic experiences that they saw and they witnessed, there is some emotional, psychological abuse that is also happening. So they tend to have those patterns too. But what is very unique to them is all the visual sensory information that is way too active compared to someone who has not. So that's where they can see something and get really easily triggered. That's why sometimes I'll have patients that are like, well, I can't work with you because you're a male, or I can't work with a female, right?
Yeah.
Because it's just seeing that person that then reminds them of the perpetrator. So then they really try to avoid it, right?
Mm-hmm.
But again, it's a visual thing. It's not necessarily how I make you feel or if I make you feel comfortable or not. It's just a visual. So that's how
Mhm.
those areas of the brain start changing, again, just to keep us safe. Because if I see something, taste something, touch something, feel something that was like that place or that environment of what happened to me, then
Mhm.
all those brain areas light up like a Christmas tree, and I go into survival mode immediately.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I'm loving this conversation because I love anything to do with psychology and how the brain and the mind work and all these different things. So part of this whole brain activity, trauma, stuff in the brain is also our inner voice, right? A
Hmm.
lot of people have this negative self-talk and the voices in their head and things
Yep.
like that. I call them ants, automatic negative thoughts.
Hmm.
So tell us about someone that has trauma and have these negative thoughts. Are these negative thoughts blame? Like you shouldn't have been in that location, you should have done this, or where is it coming from?
So they're all coming from the part of the brain that I actually love the most. It's called the posterior cingulate gyrus. The cingulate gyrus system is a part of our brain that gets fixated on ideas, thoughts, anything like that. It gets fixated when it's overworked. The posterior part of the brain, it gets fixated on things about ourselves. So every person that I have seen with traumatic experiences have a very active posterior cingulate gyrus. And that just means that they tend to self-blame and they have like an inner voice, I call it the inner bully,
Mhm.
um, that we need to rewire, we need to retrain to not be that way. And when it comes to trauma, it comes from a place of if I do XYZ or if I say XYZ, then they won't do it again.
Mm.
So it starts creating this perfectionism kind of mentality in the person. Because if
Mhm.
I am perfect, or if I'm like this, or I don't do this, or I don't do that, then they won't do it again. That's where the connection with trauma comes, right?
Right.
And yeah, it's an inner voice that is there, and we see it on the scans all the time. So when I see that, immediately I have to go into like, okay, we got to look at what these thoughts are. You'll always notice a common thread with all of them, and it's blaming myself for whatever happened.
Yeah.
Whatever the thought is, they're all, if you boil them down, it goes down to blaming myself for what happened. Because whatever in that situation, if we wouldn't have been there, it wouldn't have happened. If you think about it, it's also a survival mode,
Mhm.
right? If I
Mhm.
would have
Mhm.
done this or that, then that would have happened. And we all know that there's nothing that we could have done to prevent that from happening. That was done to us,
Yeah. Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
We are not to be blamed. It was done to me. But the
Yeah.
healing comes when I separate myself from that event, meaning I am not defined by that event. I am not defined by that person. And I have to physically, and I say physically, like for real, physically, mentally separate myself from the event and
Mhm.
that person or that hurricane or that car accident that happened.
Yeah.
So it
Yeah.
doesn't become my identity. And a lot of people who are still experiencing PTSD symptoms is because they haven't been able to do that yet.
Never able to separate themselves.
Hmm.
Yeah, as you're talking, I'm thinking to myself, right? Um, I have read a lot of testimony from women that are raped, and people tell them, oh, your dress was too short, or why did you
Hmm.
walk on that street? It's dark, or why were you out at 2 o'clock in the morning? You know what I mean? And you feel blame. If somebody breaks into your house and rapes you, I'm not quite sure how you can blame, but I'm pretty sure going back to Gabrielle Union, I think she should have locked the door or she felt that she should have done something and you go to blame. But yeah, I know that wherever negative self-talk is coming from, it's coming from the fact that you're putting yourself to blame for something that happens. Now, I don't know how you can be blamed for a hurricane unless you say, but people told you that you should evacuate and you didn't go.
Or you shouldn't have been living in that area because it's prone to hurricanes or
All
earthquakes or
right,
whatever.
yeah, okay, yeah.
It's like, well, no. Again, these things happen to us. We did not
Yeah,
cause them,
right. Yes.
right? And when we start seeing those events that way is when healing actually starts. Because then I can
Yeah,
say this, this is something that was done to me. I am not defined by this.
right. exactly. The person that did it, or the
Right. I
act
can
of
choose that.
God,
That
or
person
whatever.
chose to do that,
Yeah, that's right.
right?
Yeah, or
Or for
not, a
whatever
hurricane
reason.
is an
But
act of God. So
right.
yes.
So when we
Yeah.
start seeing those events as that,
Hmm.
because it is the reality, it is what
Yeah.
happened,
Yeah.
right? Then we can
Wow.
we can start our healing process.
Wow. Yeah. And I'm listening to you, and I know that I'm in this space, and I've interviewed lots of people on this, the brain and the mind, because that's what this show is about. And I know that it's hard work. We're talking here, and I know it's very hard to do,
Hmm.
because you're wired, right? You got to rewire the brain, and it takes work and probably years to do it. So, but it's probably gradual little steps, they come to you, and I know we're going to get into the spirituality aspect of it, but spirituality actually helps a lot of people because, it's higher power and things like that. We're going to talk about that in a minute. But if someone is listening right now and they're recognizing themselves in our conversation, they've had the big T, little T, middle T. You said everybody goes through middle T. Right.
Hmm.
And they're stuck in this loop. I love the way that you call it. It's a loop, right? What are
Hmm.
some of the things that they can start doing on a daily basis to kind of strengthen their mental resilience and start rewiring the brain?
You have to start understanding your own behaviors. You have to kind of start studying what you're doing, almost like if you're watching yourself. Um, because if you don't understand your own patterns and where they're coming from, we're going to have a hard time doing that. Now, you can always go to a professional and they'll identify them for you because we've seen this a lot, right?
Yeah.
And start seeing this as it's a biological process. It's not a moral process. It's not an ethical process that is going on. Where I'm going with this is there's the whole blame concept goes out the window because this didn't make me a bad person. Because what happens is some behaviors could be irritability and anger
Hmm.
and frustration, but you're expressing it that way. And then you start having issues with family members and friends, and people are just avoiding you because you're this mean person. Well,
Yeah.
you experience something traumatic and fight or flight, but fight is one of those. And after the fact, you tend to then start seeing those kind of behaviors. So when you start understanding, okay, I'm just angry because of what happened to me and I couldn't save myself in that moment. And now that I kind of realize what happened, now I'm dealing with the stressors. Now I'm angry all the time. And this is the part where, you hear people a lot complaining, well, this is how I'm dealing with it, or this is how, this was done to me, this is what I need to do. I don't think so. Because just by you hurting other people in your healing process, then you're creating trauma in them. So no, that's not effective, that method.
Effective,
So,
right? Yeah.
a lot of people can argue with me, and I commented on a post a while ago, and oh my goodness, I got bombarded with comments. And I'm like, well, no,
Yeah.
because now you are choosing to be angry.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
And I say that, I'm sure we're going to get what? This is not a choice. At this point, it is a choice because now I need to understand, wait, my anger is part of this pattern.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
wasn't angry before, right? And
Right.
you always have to see,
Mhm.
how was I before XYZ, right? And you
Right.
hear people say that, oh, before blah,
Hmm.
I was like this, or after whatever, now I'm like this. Okay, so now that's a product of that
Hmm.
event. And if we're
Right.
we're going
And
to a
it's,
place of like
mhm.
I'm not being identified by that event, then anger is I can be identified by anger. But today I'm dealing with its anger and I don't know how to express it. I don't know how to get rid of it. Well,
Yeah.
that's what I mean about understanding your own patterns. And it's not always the classic PTSD patterns.
Yeah, I hear you. And because I live consciously, I myself are able to to see patterns in myself. So several years back, I was very hurt by some adoptive children that I had.
Hmm.
And I found myself getting angry. And I am a bubbly, warm person. And when I
Hmm.
started feeling that this anger was coming up. I said to myself, you know what? I need to talk to a therapist to see what exactly is going on there.
Yeah.
And she said to me that, you stuff all these things down, right? So that it's coming up as anger. So
Mhm.
she told me that whenever I'm feeling triggered by something, then I breathe and release it out.
Mhm.
So that has worked for me. But yeah, so now, I kind of don't get angry anymore for things that I'm where I can get angry at my husband or whatever. But this was just me sitting here being angry, and I knew that there was a problem. My major traumatic experience happened when I was, 10 or 13, 50 years ago. So I know I'm not carrying that now, but there's some things that happen, like you call it, you keep getting, re-traumatized by life and the big
Mhm.
T's, middle T's, and I think it was like a middle T. It wasn't really a big T, middle
Mhm.
T,
Mhm.
life, right? You have some ungrateful children.
Mhm. And that's the other thing too.
Yeah.
Most of the time, that person also experienced their own levels of stress and
Well, they
trauma,
did.
and
Right.
this is
Yeah.
what they're
Yes.
expressing it, right? So
Yeah.
then
Yeah.
imagine
Yeah.
two people that have experienced trauma, how that interactions are going to go.
Hmm. Well, that's
You know?
exactly it because, I adopted children that were hurt, right? So what do? They hurt other people, right? And
Mhm.
I was caught in there and I'm thinking they should act this way and they can't, right? So it was
Right.
very hurtful to me as a person. And I kept saying, boy, I give you this much and you're just ungrateful and all that. But once you understand
Hmm.
that they're not able to love, they're not able to
No.
connect, right? They're not able because of the trauma that they've been through,
Hmm.
right? So anyway, I would just,
At
lend
least,
it.
at least I can tell you this with certainty. Right now, they're not able to.
Right, right. That's what I heard.
Hmm.
Therapists said to me when they get to the 30s, maybe they'll.
Or when they actually maybe heal from their own trauma,
Right.
then they start seeing, oh, wait a minute, you know, this person was taking care of me, was loving me.
Mhm.
Because, you are also able to heal. And now
Yeah.
you're also able to look back at like, well, maybe some of that behavior that I did wasn't me, right? Sometimes I say, well, that's the I use the word that's the trauma talking, right? That's the trauma
Right.
behaving, right? That's not me. That's not what I mean to do,
It's
right?
true.
So then,
Yeah.
but you have that self-awareness. Now, that posterior singular that I talked about, why I love it so much is that if you train it well, you can turn it into an inner cheerleader.
Hmm. Okay.
And you can actually cheer yourself up, not beat yourself down like a bully.
Good
Right?
boy.
So,
Yeah.
but that ability to have self-awareness comes from that same place. So most people who've experienced traumatic experiences can actually be a lot more resilient than the average person because of that part of their brain. Because then they have emotional intelligence, which that's where the emotional intelligence comes from, the posterior cingulate gyrus. So it's about being able to also retrain that psychological system because then you can build a person that has a lot more resilience than anybody else because now they're self-aware, they're aware of others and their feelings and their emotions, and that's emotional intelligence.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree. Yeah. And then they say, we'll get to the spirituality part now, but
Mhm.
the Bible says what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. So you become stronger. All right.
Exactly.
So you uniquely bridge science and faith. How does science and spirituality work together in healing trauma?
So spirituality, I don't separate it. And I say that because whether you believe in whatever you believe, it's there. Right? The spiritual realm is there, whether you believe it or not. It's like I remember a while ago I had to explain that to a teenager. I'm like, do you believe in gravity? And they're like, well, no, yeah. I mean, it's not something you believe in. I'm like, exactly. Right? It's
Right,
not a belief system. It's there, right? Whether
right,
you like
right.
it or not, right? And in other parts of the universe, there's no gravity, right? So that concept, the same thing happens with spirituality. The way we communicate and connect with the spiritual world is actually also a brain function.
Mm.
Our right temporal lobe is where a lot of the spiritual understanding lives, right? So I know that because that's the part of my brain where hopefulness lives, where resilience lives, where the understanding of more lives. It's in the right temporal lobe. So what does that tell us? That tells us that For whatever reason, that was placed in our brain to function that way, to have a connection with the spiritual world. So for me is okay, so we experience this traumatic stressor, this event, this thing that occurred to me. If I don't identify by it, now what? Right? What's next? Right? I already, I'm healed from it. I separated myself from that event. What am I supposed to be working towards? What else should I be looking at? And that's where I say we look at the spiritual world. Because then I can start looking at things like resilience, right? What is resilience? Resilience is I'm able to go through stressors and get through the other side like if nothing happened, just brush myself off, right? I can go through the same thing again, just like we talked about at the beginning, and I can brush myself off because I know what to do now, right? I learned from that. Now we have to be our eyes open and really learn from what's happening and how my body is reacting to it, and now after the fact. But then we got to look at things like discipline, integrity. These are pillars that I pay attention to the most because it creates a person that becomes more human. And when we become more human, that's where the spiritual world comes in, right? We talk about the concept of faith, right? But faith without any of those things, there's nothing there, right? We have to have the discipline, we have to have the motivation, the integrity, the ability to say, I understand this and I'm going to pursue it because I want more out of this, this physical world.
Okay. So, I understand that. So if someone believes, when you started off talking, I remember, someone that was part of my family and didn't believe in God
Mhm.
because he said it's not logical. So I
Right.
know exactly where the right brain people in and the left brain people, the
Mhm.
right brain people are going to have hope and they're going
Right.
to look at the sky and they're going to see beauty and they're going to look at the trees like me,
Yeah.
right? And know that there's a spirit in the trees and all that kind of stuff. I'm very right brain. But the
Mhm.
left brain person is going to be logical. It says, well, if there's a God, why don't I see it? I mean, can I touch it? However you want to label that.
Mhm.
So, but I didn't get your explanation of how that helps with trauma. I mean, I was thinking about, I also had a very close friend that was addicted to crack
Mhm.
and he couldn't get off of it. And he went through the Salvation Army program several times, a 2-year program, and they lead with spirituality. I'm not sure what they do there, but it's somehow in order to recover, you've got to believe in God and you got to believe whatever you have to believe. So, so that's where I was going with the question. How does spirituality help you release the trauma? I guess that's the proper question.
Well, spirituality definitely allows us to release the trauma because of the hopefulness part,
Okay.
right? If the person is hopeless, they're really going to have a hard time
Mm,
releasing the trauma, right? And
mm,
that really takes us down the avenue of spirituality, right? Because something I can't see, right?
right.
Um,
Okay.
Now, when someone is more quote unquote logical, right? And they use that excuse and I call it an excuse because you just are trying to have two people that see things different ways communicate to each other, and that's going to be kind of difficult. You still got to kind of find that middle person to be able to make that happen because anything that is God related is totally logical. It's just how it's explained to that logical person. So let's say you
Okay.
have this person that only sees a circle, right? And then you have another person that see a sphere with like specific colors and textures on that sphere. So they're
Mhm.
trying to communicate with each other, but one can only see circles. You can
Mhm.
throw a bunch of spheres at them and they're like, well, I see a circle. I
Circle.
don't see the details,
That's
right?
a good
I'm
example.
looking at just this thing because that's all I need to see to survive. And I'm
Hmm.
fine with it. And there's nothing wrong with that person, right? But the other person see a sphere. Now the
Hmm.
other person cannot see a circle. So they might spend hours over analyzing this fear
Hmm.
when the other person just move on. right? So you have two different people. So that's the same thing with when we're trying to explain spirituality to someone who only sees circles, right?
Mhm.
One is not better than the other. It's just how he sees that world. All we have to do then is show them that in that sphere, God also lives.
Mhm.
It's just you have to explain it to them in their terms, right?
Right,
In
right.
circle terms, if that makes any sense, right? Where the person that sees
Yeah.
spheres, you need to show them the flowers and the sounds and the music and the scents, right? So they can understand who God is and what God is, right?
Right.
So it's about communication. It's about understanding. So you have to use the right language for each person. So
Mhm.
in my studies in theology, it's super logical to see that the spiritual world is there, right?
Right,
But
right.
if we were going to explain it to someone that sees only circles, you need to explain it in their terms because they're not going to get it, right? And the same thing vice versa.
Right. I love your analogies because I can see it right away. Because yeah, you look at
Hmm.
it's like a donut, right?
Yeah.
You look in the hole and you see nothing, or that's probably not a good word, but you look at a cell, for instance, and you see nothing, but you know there's activity in it. That's
Hmm.
probably a better
Hmm.
one,
Right.
right?
Because
There's like
the person
millions
has
and
to
millions
know
of
that.
cells.
They have to have
Right,
the knowledge.
right. Yes, that's
That's it.
perfect. I love your analogies. Awesome. All right. So your field is this SPECT imaging, which is SPECT, and I know that the SPECT stands for something.
Hmm.
So let's talk about that and how you use it to help somebody that has trauma and survival loop and patterns, and they have to think outside the circle. How do you help them with
Well,
that? Right.
spec is something that that we've been using in psychiatry to look at brain activity, but it's not the only one. That one is just easy to explain it to anybody. So that person that sees circles, they can totally understand it when I show them the spec image. But the first reason why I use it in some people is because some people need to see, right? They can't just go by what I'm telling them, right? They want a visual. They want to be able to understand more, right? Remember, we talked about earlier that usually people with trauma, they hyperfixate on the events because they want to explain it. They're looking for an explanation. So they want to understand more. So I understand that. So a spec is a great way to start showing them, listen, you're not crazy, right? You're not making it up. Look. And I go like this because there's a diamond pattern that shows up on the SPECT scan, and that's emotional trauma. So
Mhm.
your reaction, all these areas that are lighting up, these areas, this is causing this set of issues. This other area, this other set of issues. And this one, all of this. And all of that is because you experienced this diamond pattern that is showing up on the brain scan that tells me you went through a psychological stressor. You went through an emotional stressor. So you did not, all these symptoms, all these problems that you're having in all these areas of your life, you're not making them up, right? Because that is where a lot of it starts. It's for them to see, I'm not making them up. I'm not crazy. I'm not this bad person. I'm not this stupid person that I think or people think that I am, right? So showing someone in color that their brain is behaving a certain way is a lot easier than for me to sit there and tell them, right? So it starts with that, why I like to use images. And also, I used to be a fashion photographer. So for me, images is super easy to explain.
Oh yeah.
So
So
it's
a
like,
visual person, yes.
yeah, I'm very visual. So I like to explain that way so people can understand it. And then when I break down every single area in our evaluation and I tell them how that leads to this whole thing of PTSD, then they're like, okay, now I want to do what you're telling me to do. Because it's not just about taking a picture of your brain and how it's behaving. It's now what?
Mhm.
What's next? What am I going to do now? Where am I going to go? Because when people experience trauma, some people are looking for something, right? And then they'll try everything. And you can't
Right,
try everything because that's a waste of time, money, and resources. And you need to have a good structure and plan to say, you're not ready for this. Let's start over here first, and then we do this. Because sometimes if you do some therapies too soon, you actually get really triggered,
right.
you know? So that also maps for me what the next steps are going to be in this person's healing process. So it
Okay, that's
doesn't just
awesome.
gives them the visual, but it gives me the ability to plan.
Just set the program for them.
Hmm.
So as you were talking, I thought to myself, so someone will come in and says, yeah, I was sexually abused as a child. I was raped. I was, the physical stuff. But we
Hmm.
also started off our conversation that spilling coffee when you're
Uh-huh.
driving or something, and maybe you crashed, that could be a little T trauma, but your brain reacts the same way. So how many people come in and you show them this SPECT scan and they weren't aware that they had trauma? Is there any such
A good
thing?
number of people. A good
I
number of
thought so.
people.
I got that
Yeah.
when you were
A
talking.
good number
Right.
of people
Mhm.
because they've all, but when someone comes to me already, they've been through like 4 or 5 psychiatrists, they've been diagnosed with 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 diagnoses.
Wow.
And I always, I was at a lecture that I gave not so long ago where I did my residency, and I talked to them about this, and I said, when you start putting 5, 6 diagnoses in someone, it's none of those. So you got to look for what really it is. And usually
Yeah.
in these people is PTSD.
Wow.
But because it's manifesting so differently to
Mhm.
psychiatrist A, I think this is depression. Psychiatrist B, I
I
think
was just going to
this is kind
say
of
depression
anxiety.
is probably the top one, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Mhm.
So then they come with multiple diagnoses, multiple treatment plans. And that's where I'm always like, listen, we got to diagnose correctly,
Mhm.
effectively. So then we put together a treatment plan for that person and in certain steps, because this is not Tylenol. You're not just gonna pop a pill and in 4 hours you're good. No pain. No, no, no. This is a lot more complex
I
because
like
the
that.
whole
I like
system
that.
gets
Mhm.
restructured,
Okay.
you know?
All right. So that sounds really great because yeah, I thought so. Because you said military trauma, everybody has them, but some
Hmm.
people are resilient and
Hmm.
they go through it and they get through the other side, and some people stay stuck. And then you have the little T traumas that they are not even aware it's a trauma,
Hmm.
but the brain kept saying, no, I don't want to go there, and I don't want to go here, and I don't want to talk to this person, and I don't want to, you know what I mean? And you're thinking you're just avoiding life. But that's what I know about. Or you talk about the fact they become hypo and they you do the same thing that they should be avoiding. So yeah, this was a great conversation. I love it. That's if I'm going to take away anything from this conversation is that the brain processes it all the same way. It's beautiful. It's beautiful. Beautiful brain we have here. They
Wicked.
can't, they even all the knowledge that they have, they can't recreate it. So it's a beautiful
Yeah.
thing.
And it's something that I do tell people when we start going in through like hardcore into the healing process of trauma. I always because then they're like, let's say anxiety is one of them and panic attacks, and people tend to fear those and reject them. I'm like, listen, every once in a while, thank your brain for getting anxious.
Yeah.
That's an alarm telling me there's something wrong. Now, it
Yeah.
doesn't always turn on because it doesn't have to be, but yours is hyper turned on. So we just have to rewire it. But thank
Mhm.
it because that's
Yeah.
part of its job. It's an
I
organ.
like
That's
that.
it.
Reframe it. Yes.
Hmm.
I love
Hmm.
it. I love it. All right. So tell our listeners how they can connect with you, your website, social media, so they can get connected to you for this powerful work that you're doing.
Sure. So our website is whitebutterflyclinic.com. That's the name of our practice. And Dr. underscore Hector is on my Instagram, and White Butterfly Clinic is the other one. So we're pretty much everywhere. We also have a wellness magazine that it's based on these pillars that we talked about. So every issue is a different theme, like the resilience issue, the integrity issue. The confidence issue is the latest one that we have up there, and they're all free and they're on our website. And that's where you can find us.
Wow, that's amazing. All right. So they go on your website, and if they're interested in psychiatry, it tells them there what to do.
Hmm. Hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, everything is in
Yes.
there.
Everything
Very,
is on there.
very easy to use.
I love it. I love the work that you do. I'm pretty sure there's a lot of people that's listening that would say, wow, I need to get me some of Dr. Right, Hector. Right. Amazing, amazing, amazing. All right. Well, I'm going to have a, summary of my conversation with Dr. Hector on the show page, which is myhelps.us. I will link out to his website, a link out to social media so you can follow him and get some more of this great information. Yes, listen, Our brain is a super, super organ, and everything that you do. I was even telling my daughter the other day, you can't do anything without your brain first being aware of it. You can't pick up
Mhm.
this pen. You can't bend down to touch your toes. Your brain has to send a signal. If the brain doesn't send a signal, you can't do it. So I love the brain. I love the mind. I love what it does for humanity and what it does for humans, I should say.
Mhm. Mhm.
So I love everything about this conversation. But if there's one thing that I'm taking away from this is that you are not broken. We didn't talk a lot about that, but you're not broken, right? Your brain adapted to protect you. And the beautiful news is that it can be rewired to heal you.
Mhm.
Right. It's going into protection mode. But, with Dr. Hector and the work that he's doing, once you become aware of something, then you can address it. But if you're not aware of it, you can't address it. So, yeah, so Dr. Hector reminded us that healing isn't just about managing our symptoms, it's about transforming the way we think, feel, and live from the inside out. So, if this episode, blessed you, make sure that you subscribe, leave a review, share it with someone who needs to hear this message. I know you know someone that's stuck in a loop, that not understanding why they're angry, why they're hypo something when they should be hyper something. So yes, and so remember, transformers, that's what I call you guys now. When you transform your mind, you can also transform your life, transform your brain. Yeah, so I love this episode. So Dr. Hector, as we wrap up, any last words of encouragement for our audience?
I would always say take care of your brain. You only have one. You can't get a transplant. So take care of it. Feed it well, give it exercise, protect it because it's our most important organ.
It is. It is the most important organ, and one that you can physically see.
Mhm.
I talk a lot about the mind, and nobody knows where the mind is, but we all know where the brain is.
Mhm. Mhm. Mhm.
Right. Yes. So listen, thank you, Dr. Hector, for being on the
Thank
show.
you.
Thank you for a lot of the aha nuggets that I'm going to take away from our conversation. Thank you guys for tuning in to this week's episode of Transform Your Mind so you can transform your life. So we're going to add another thing on there. Be aware of what your brain is doing, and be conscious of it. And if you find that you have a problem brain, then we can heal it. Right. So thank you, Dr. Hector. Thank you guys for
Thank you.
tuning in. Until next time, keep growing, keep healing, and keep becoming your best self ever. Namaste.